Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Just as a committee led by former UN Chief Kofi Annan has made recommendations to Myanmar about its treatment of the Rohingya Muslim, there has been another attack on the minority group. Now, authorities say that Rohingya militants attacked security forces, and the Rohingyas say it was police which came into their neighborhood and fired shots at them. Either way, it puts an area which is already on the edge closer to tipping over. Stay with us as we take a look at the most persecuted minority in the world. They're called the Rohingyas.
Myanmar's persecuted Rohingya Muslims have been facing yet another deadly crackdown at the hands of the country's army. The anti-Rohingya onslaught followed coordinated attacks on police posts and an army base in the volatile Rakhine state. Authorities put the blame on Rohingya, saying some 1,000 insurgents from 50 villages were involved in the attacks. This marks a major escalation since last October, when similar attacks prompted the killing and rape of hundreds of Muslim men and women there. The army's brutal crackdown on predominantly Muslim areas then sparked condemnations from the UN and international rights organizations, as well as regional countries. The situation deteriorated earlier this month, when security forces began a new operation in Rakhine state, forcing thousands more Muslims to flee to neighboring Bangladesh. The harsh treatment of over 1 million Rohingya has emerged as the most contentious human rights issue in the Buddhist majority country. Rights groups have in the past documented a pattern of abuse, including arson attacks, killings, maiming and raping of Rohingya by the army and extremist Buddhist groups. On Thursday, a commission appointed by the government of Aung San Suu Kyi itself came up with a scathing report and urged Myanmar to scrap restrictions imposed on movement and citizenship of Rohingya. The commission, led by former UN Chief Kofi Annan, warned that failure to implement the commission's recommendations can lead to more violence.
If it's not implemented, it will mean that the situation on the ground could continue to deteriorate.
Rights groups hailed the report, with Amnesty International calling on Myanmar's government to, quote, address long-standing grievances and redress decades of violations against Rohingya.
People in Rakhine State, in particular the Muslim Rohingya minority, have suffered a horrific catalogue of rights abuses for decades.
Large-scale violence against Rohingya Muslims has claimed hundreds of lives and forced tens of thousands to flee across the border since 2012. It remains to be seen if Myanmar's leader and Nobel Peace Laureate Aung San Suu Kyi acts this time around to alleviate the suffering of Rohingya, taking into account the recommendation of her own appointed commission.
Because if it's not implemented, it will mean that the situation on the ground...
I'd like to welcome our guest to the program out of London, Director Shafakna Institute for Middle Eastern Studies, Ms. Catherine Shakhta, and out of Ireland, author and journalist, Mr. Gearóid Ó Colmáin. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off with you, Gearóid. What is behind the clash with the Rohingyas and the state of Myanmar?
I think the first thing that needs to be pointed out here is that there is no such thing as Rohingya. Okay, we're talking about, in Myanmar in particular, are immigrants from Bangladesh. The Burmese government doesn't recognize immigrants as citizens. And so the main legal issue here is who's a citizen and who isn't. And the Burmese authorities, their position is that these people do not qualify for citizenship in Burma according to the 1984 citizenship law, which is quite strict, and which basically demarcates three types of citizens. Natural citizens, that is to say, people who were born in Myanmar before 1833, or 1823 rather, associated citizens and naturalized citizens. I've heard a lot of reports about Buddhist violence, but there haven't been any reports about the Islamist violence against Buddhist communities, which has been ongoing for many years, in fact. There's a long history of it, going back at least to the Mongdo massacre of 1942, when, during the war, when over 30,000 Buddhists were massacred by these self-same so-called Rohingya. So I think that the debate about this has been extremely biased in favor of the Rohingya, and the other side of the debate hasn't been heard at all. And I think the idea or the agenda here is to destabilize the country. That is what, for example, the Burmese government has said. People are trying to destabilize the country.
Okay.
And I accuse the human rights organizations of attempting that destabilization. The very organizations you cited there, Human Rights Watch.
Stay with me, Gearóid. Stay with me. Let me get Catherine in on this discussion. Catherine, your take on what you have heard our guests in Ireland say.
Well, I don't completely agree with him, I must say. I think that the situation in Myanmar is actually disturbing in that the Myanmar government is insisting on conflating the idea of religion with a sense of sovereignty and nationality, or right to nationality. This is something, I'm afraid, if we could draw a parallel, would be, maybe go back to, Palestine and Israel, where, we are being, told that there's a certain binary. And I think this is exactly what you have in Myanmar, is that somehow, the Rohingya Muslims have been persecuted on account of their faith because it disturbs maybe Myanmar government in their own sense of, identity. And they would like to basically cleanse the country of the other to better establish, their sovereignty and the right to have a Buddhist government. This is disturbing because this is a pattern that we actually see, repeated across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East now, because of course it's been a precedent already, and we never really tackled it. We never got down to the real issue. So beyond geopolitics, I think you have an issue of sovereignty and nationality. How do you define nationality, and where does religion get computed in? This is a difficult situation, and I don't agree when your guest is saying that the Rohingya have persecuted Buddhists. I think that it's rather clear today, anyway, that they are the one being persecuted, and no one is really doing anything, which is interesting again because when you look to the Middle East and the boundaries that are being told exist in between Sunnis and Shia, and this all sectarian issue that was fabricated, by the way, then no one is saying anything about the Rohingya. How come? They are being persecuted. No one is mentioning the fact that they are Sunni and they have been completely abandoned by the likes of Saudi Arabia, for example. I found this quite interesting too, because we need to talk about this. It's not just a detail. It's rather important, knowing that Saudi Arabia could quite easily weigh in and actually influence and maybe lean on Myanmar government. It's not doing that at all. Why is that?
Okay. Well, Gearóid, you talked about other entities perhaps being behind this. I want to talk about that. Which entities could actually benefit, if you want to say that, from clashing taking place inside of Myanmar?
Well, first of all, the rulers of the earth, the United States, Britain, France, the European powers, but also regional powers. I disagree with the assessment there of the media coverage of this. I mean, the BBC have been promoting the Rohingya as victims and have been demonizing the Burmese authorities. I haven't seen any objective reports in any of the Western media sources on this issue. The Saudis are financing a lot of the propaganda war in favor of the Rohingya. Now, there are, of course, many innocent people involved in this, caught up in the conflict, and powers, big powers who have nothing to do with them, are responsible. And these are the migrants, the poor migrants coming from Bangladesh. They are poor people who are coming into Burma, and many of them are being recruited by these terrorist organizations, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And of course, you have the Rohingya Liberation Organization and the Rohingya Solidarity Organization, which are linked to Al-Qaeda. So the structure of power, if you like, is similar to the kind of scenario we're looking at in Syria. In other words, first of all, blame the government for everything. The target government here is Myanmar, which of course is getting closer to China and has been for a long time. India is unhappy with that. Bangladesh is unhappy with that. Bangladesh have had serious issues with Myanmar over the Bay of Bengal and gas exploration there. The Indians would like to see their marine control the Bay of Bengal and therefore stop the Chinese. That's in US interests, and that's the main geopolitical agenda here. We must point out as well that Myanmar is a post-colonial country which is attempting to foment national unity. Extremely difficult in a country with so many different ethnic minorities and potential civil war from many, many sides all the time. And so there's many strings that can be pulled here. Right now we're dealing with a form of coercive engineered migration. They don't want, first of all, if you look at the laws in citizenship law, it's quite strict and it's quite nationalist, and that's something that is a threat to globalization. Particularly those human rights groups who are quite internationalist, operate in every country and attack any country that's trying to defend itself against globalization. So I disagree with the assessment here that the media are not paying attention to Rohingya. I see nothing but biased coverage, demonization of Buddhist monks in that country, and completely ignoring the ongoing attacks on Buddhist communities by these al-Qaeda-linked terrorists.
Okay, let me turn back to Catherine in London. Catherine, your perspective, what can be done to de-escalate the tension in Myanmar?
Well, I think, first of all, pluralism needs to be asserted, and freedom of religion would be number one. I do agree with your guest's assessment when he said that there is indeed a risk, that the likes of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, type militants would break into Myanmar, and this is something that, for example, Wahhabi Saudi Arabia has been trying to do anyway, use instability and pit people, against one another, on account of instability that they quite often generate themselves. But not to the extent, that, it has been portrayed here. I think that there's a real, genocide going on against the Rohingya that has been going on for decades, by the way. So it's not something new. I think that what is happening is that certain powers in the region are using, are already using what is, a situation which exists, and to try to, to angle it in their favor. That would be my assessment. And that, that being said, I think Myanmar has a lot of work to do in understanding that, nationalism and religion don't need to be conflated, and that, belonging to a certain faith doesn't automatically, equate to a nationality. This is very important. This is something that, very sadly we have kind of been moving towards, and people keep conflating the two. They're very distinct. People have a right to change their mind, and they have a right, to abide by whichever faith they wish to. This is something that the state should not, get involved to impose or anything like that. Pluralism is important if you want to talk about a healthy society. And sadly, in Asia, I mean, there is a great degree of, people are becoming more and more radicalized. But, we can't forget that communities are being stuck in this cycle of violence. You can't just keep trying to, brush an entire community and say, oh, let's blame it on a minority. We have to understand that most, Rohingya Muslims are actually the victims and are being held hostage by other people's policies and decisions. This is something that we keep losing track of, whether it's in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, or again here in this situation in Myanmar. It's important that we realize that people are dying, and we need to, something needs to be done. And I agree for once, with Kofi Annan, is that, if something is not being done quickly, we're going to go back to an escalation in violence, and people will pay the price with their lives. We are talking about real people with real life and family, and these people don't deserve to be treated the way they are right now.
Well, what about the committee led by Kofi Annan, Gearóid? What do you think about the recommendations and basically what has been said, that if the recommendations are not followed, the situation will deteriorate greatly?
Well, Kofi Annan is one of the chief war criminals responsible for the implementation of the responsibility to protect doctrine. It was Kofi Annan who was in charge of the formulation of that doctrine after the US backed a mass killing in Rwanda in 1994, where again the victim was blamed by the so-called international community. Now, that doctrine that was developed by Kofi Annan was used to justify the carpet bombing and destruction and genocide in Libya, and has been the main justification for the war against Syria as well. So we have the same people who are formulating policy on Myanmar, and nobody seems to be interested in the other side of the story here, particularly the brutal killings and the destruction of Buddhist temples ongoing, where Buddhists are a minority in northern parts of Rakhine State. And nobody talks about that. I don't see any objective reports. No attempt is made to talk about that. I mean, I've seen, for example, this Urutu monk, the Venerable Urutu. He's completely demonized every time he makes a statement. It's taken out of context, badly translated. Again, I think the problem here, of course, is that very few people speak the language, very few people can actually go to primary sources, very few people have been there, and so on. But nevertheless, the entire Western media propaganda system has been in favor of the Rohingya, and it completely ignored the claims of the other side. And that's not objective. You have to look at both sides here. Countries are entitled to have national identity and to define their national identity according to their own culture and traditions. I don't agree that a pluralistic society is necessarily in itself a good thing.
Well, Gearóid, you said, let me just jump in here, Gearóid, because you said that you feel that the Western media has been, stay with me, Gearóid, you said that the Western media has been somewhat biased, but many observers would say that it has actually, the story has been ignored a lot, and actually more recently now we're seeing some more coverage on the story. What would you say to that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, ignored. Every time you see a report about the Rohingya, they're portrayed as the victims, and there's nothing about the ongoing attacks against Buddhists. Urutu, have you seen any objective reports of Urutu, the demonized Buddhist monk? I haven't seen any. If you look at the documentaries, they actually go into the temple. BBC have done this. Other TV stations have done the same. They go into his temples. They have extensive graphic evidence of massacres of Buddhists, and I haven't seen any investigation of those attacks. Did they take place? Did they talk to families of those victims?
All right, Catherine, what do you think about that? You're a media person. Your take, do you think that the Western media outlets have been biased against the Buddhists, or how have you seen the coverage on this event in general?
Well, I'm going to say that as a rule of thumb, yes, Western media are biased anyway, and they're trying to angle news in a certain way to fit, their agenda. That's again the rule of thumb. Now, when it comes to Myanmar, I'm going to disagree here, because here's the problem. I mean, we can't deny that the Rohingya Muslims are being massacred, are being, persecuted on account of their faith. And I'm not saying that Buddhists as well have not been targeted, but they have been targeted by this minority that we referred earlier on, Al-Qaeda, ISIS-like type people, Wahhabis who are trying to again create a narrative and fan tensions essentially. Now, it would be, in my mind, the responsibility of the Myanmar government to actually diffuse this situation by not trying to perpetuate, or actually even, make it out as to be an institution to genocide and systematically persecute Rohingya Muslims on account that, they are not national of the country, that they cannot be citizen because they're Muslim. So, to have, your guests to actually forward this narrative and to say that countries are entitled to do whatever it is that they want when it comes to, nationality and how people's citizenship should be defined. Well, I disagree, because if you don't have, freedom of religion, and if you define a nationality according to someone's faith, you're going to have a problem. So whether people like pluralism or not, it is a reality that we have to kind of wrap our minds, around. People come in all shapes and sizes, and they do believe in different things. You can't get into their heads and cleanse it. It doesn't work this way. Okay. So I would say that the burden of guilt is on the Myanmar government, because they're the one in power.
Gearóid, what about Aung San Suu Kyi? Gearóid, what about Aung San Suu Kyi? Do you think that she really wants to solve the situation in a fair manner there?
Well, she was always the darling of the Western powers, of the British and the Americans during the Cold War, and she was used by them, and she used them as well. And they eventually did break down the nationalist regime there and got her into power. So now you have a situation where she's in power, but she doesn't control the military fully, and she doesn't have complete power in the country. Nobody really knows what she thinks. She had an important lawyer, a Muslim lawyer, who was her advisor. He was shot, he was assassinated recently. Nobody knows who did it. So it could be any side. We don't know. Nevertheless, she's under extreme pressure to basically cow down to this nonsense narrative that the Rohingya are victims, that that there's a genocide going on. So there's no evidence for this, by the way. There's absolutely no evidence, not a shred of evidence, of a state-sponsored, programmed killing of ethnic minorities based on based on ethnicity or religion.
All right, stay with me, Gearóid. Catherine, what about that? Stay with me, Gearóid, because we're almost out of time. What about that? There's no state evidence, according to our guests in Ireland.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to disagree. I mean, and I understand that Western, media are biased, but I mean, images don't lie, and the situation on the ground is telling you that yes, people are being massacred on account of their faith, and the government is in charge, of what is going on within their borders. So, by default, they are guilty. Whether it is something, that has been architected by the government or whether they allow it to happen, it doesn't really matter. The result is that they're guilty by association, if anything. So again, if you are the authority and something happens within your borders, then you are responsible for it. This is the law. And there is definitely something to be done. They have refused to do it. Why? Why is it that people are being persecuted? And regardless, beyond religion, it doesn't really matter, beyond politics as well. Again, communities are being persecuted on account of what? Women and children are being killed. And, we can't just dismiss it and say, oh, it's someone else's fault. No, it is a reality which is ongoing and needs to be addressed. That's the bottom line.
And on that note, I'd like to thank both our guests for being with us. We're out of time, though. Appreciate you guys being on the debate. Out of London, Catherine Shaknam, Director of Shafakna Institute for Middle Eastern Studies, and out of Cork, Ireland, Gearóid Ó Colmáin, author and journalist. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on this debate. Make sure you join us same time, same place tomorrow. I'm Marcia Hashimi, signing up for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. See you next time.